right, everybody. So this morning talked mainly about unemployment and the different types of unemployment. We looked at CPI yesterday, which introduced the idea of inflation, which I'm sure is a concept that was at least somewhat familiar to everybody. I'm going to go through a bunch of different kind of statistics, measurement, actually. It's measurement tools in macro here, just to get you to identify with all the different kind of ways, not all of them, but some of the different ways that we can measure economic performance in terms of, and then with the goal of making things relatively equal in a population. Okay, so I'm going to start with the whole idea of inflation. We're going to talk about inflation in terms of what it is, right? And so it's increasing the general price level of things in the economy. To put things in perspective in terms of, I talked about, real wage versus wage. So if you make $100,000 a year now, you're doing well. But if you made $100,000 in the 1950s, you would be doing extremely well, right? Like the comparison in terms of prices is makes it that much more different. And the difference between the 1950s and now is how much inflation, how much prices have changed. So first thing I'm going to do is go through why inflation happens and the different ways it could happen. So the first one, this is our general graph. So we are used to this bad boy like that, right? So there's you got your supply and demand curves, price and quantity. So that's what we did in micro. That's looking at individual markets, slivers of the economy. And so looking at individual supply and demand curves. This is looking at, I'm going to erase that, it's in the way now. This is looking at the economy as a big picture, and it has this idea of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, which I talked about in the previous video. Being that this is all the supply in the economy put together and all the demand put together for various goods and stuff like that. So aggregate supply, as I said, eventually becomes a vertical line because at a certain point, you can't employ any more resources. This is also when you're at full employment. And the idea of full employment, remember from way before, I think, the idea of that is when all your resources are put towards a task of goods and services. And in Canada, the natural, the idea of, so we just went through unemployment. The rate of natural unemployment in Canada is between 5 and 7%. That means that at full employment, we still have 5 to 7% people that don't have a job who are looking for a job. And that's because of that idea of frictional employment, cyclical, structural unemployment, right? So people going in between jobs, people losing jobs because an industry shrinks or because you have, the improper training, not enough this, not enough that. So that's a natural part of the economy. And between 5 and 7% is basically where our unemployment rate would sit. Okay, so this full employment, aggregate supply, right? Those kinds are related in that way that there's a wall that you hit at some point. Aggregate demand, right? That's pretty straightforward. So notice this, by the way, is real GDP. So that means real when it's this. That means that it's adjusted for inflation. Okay, so it just means that if you didn't adjust things for inflation, somebody that, again, looking at the wage, if you made $30,000 in the 1950s and then you said you still made $30,000 now, if that's not an adjusted wage, you're making barely anything. You've lost a lot of purchasing power. But anyway, moving on. Okay, so the first example of how inflation happens is a demand pull. So this is basically when you have basically at full employment, and because of full employment, right, there are more resources out there, and what it does is it causes excess demand. Okay, so we think that prices are going to go up, so we're going to increase our demand. We're going to increase the price because the demand is going to increase. So that's one way of inflation happening. So this is basically in good times, when you have a booming economy, people have jobs, and they want to buy things now because they have the resources, and they also expect prices to go up in the future. Okay, the next one is a cost push. Cost push is anything that makes the supply curve shift to the left or decrease. So this could be anything like taxes, energy costs, your wage, things that lower your available supply of something, and it's going to cause, as you can see, the national income to shrink, and the demand to also go backwards. This again because people have less money or disposable income to spend on things in general. Okay, so that's going to drive that the opposite way. We could also have this same thing called an imported cost push. That just means that prices are driven by imports instead of by domestic products. And structural, okay, again, that could be a bunch of different things. One of the big ones would be there's a certain industry that's expanding and we have a shortage in that industry. So if if there was an increase in nanotechnology, but we didn't have the proper scientists and engineers to be looking at that stuff, then we could have a structural cause of inflation because of that gap. All right, so what does inflation do? Inflation redistributes income. Now, it doesn't do it evenly, and there's going to be some people that gain, and there's going to be some people that end up less off? No. Worse off, there's the word. All right, so in general, borrowers of money, they are the ones that are going to gain from inflation, right? Because they have that money in pocket. They're going to be paying, the interest rate was lower when they brought it out, and it's worth more than what it did before. And losers, so lenders are going to lose out when inflation goes up. Now, it's funny, other people that are going to lose on increasing inflation, so unskilled workers, they say non-union workers, but I'll get to that in 1 second, and fixed income earners that are pensioners. And they lose out because their purchasing power is going to shrink, right? If your wage doesn't move, which I talked about yesterday, if your wage doesn't move, then you're going to be able to buy less with the amount of money you bring in. So that's why these unskilled workers, we're talking about minimum wage workers, things like that, ones that don't see a lot of raises in their jobs. Non-union workers, they say that because union workers in general get to negotiate through collective bargaining. They get to negotiate new contracts. Doesn't always keep up with inflation, which we see again and again in different industries. Now, my pushback on the non-union workers is that the private industry actually goes up by a larger percentage than union workers in the last little while. So that means people in the private sector actually get higher raises per year. The problem with that is that's not evenly distributed. So that means that somebody who's higher up gets a promotion in their job, becomes CEO, and they get a 30% bump in salary, versus somebody who's working in the mailroom and gets no increase, right? So if you balance the two of those out, it looks like 15% average. Well, that's not true. Only mathematically it's true, but when you look at it in terms of the real world, one person got all of it and the other person got nothing. So that's why it's non-union workers, because you have that dichotomy between in private sector jobs where some people aren't going to see wage increases because they have lower level jobs, more fixed income jobs, and then you have people that maybe their jobs are based on sales and they have a really good year, or they're based on they get a promotion and they get a big jump in salary. Okay, so fixed income earners, pensioners, that's some pensioners have their pension is indexed to inflation, so they get that's my father does that. He says he gets a raise every year, which he does, which is good for him, of course, and that's what I hope to have. But anyway, it's harder and harder to get that where your pension is indexed to inflation. But that's the pensioner that's not involved in this, not a loss. Pensioner that doesn't have that, they are going to lose out, because they are going to lose their pension of, say, $40,000 a year. May have been really good when they retired, but it continues to get worse as time goes on. Okay, moving on now. There's a bunch of different things that came out that you could have seen when you were looking at the different ways to measure in unemployment and looking at that this morning. One of the things is a low income cutoff, and that's the measurement of how much money a salary somebody brings in based on how many people are in the household. So the household income, and it's the cutoff point where that amount of money is going to allow the person to live with putting less than 20% of their income towards food, shelter, and clothing. Anything more than that, and that's when they start to consider that to be too much. Now, it's interesting that they use this. I question this because of the recent 5 years or more, I'd say even more than that. Oh, it is more than that. Money has been cheap to borrow. Interest rates have been very low, and therefore it's very cheap to borrow money. Not as much to lend money has not been that cheap. So to borrow money has been cheap, and so people, I think a lot more people spend more than 20% of their income on those things. You can just think of people that basically they're overextending themselves with a very large house, and they become what's called house poor, meaning they can't do anything else because they own a bigger house than they could really afford. And the problem is compounded by the fact that money is cheap, so people are going to overextend themselves in terms of debt. They'll not only get a new car, new house, they'll go on vacation, all these things, but they don't actually own any of these things, and it gets worse and compounded because then people then remortgage houses, or then they buy another car before they finish paying off their current vehicle, and it ends up it's almost never a good deal to refinance for a new car before you've paid off the car that you have. That's because usually your payments have, your car is depreciated ahead of your payments. The only way that works is if your car is worth more than what you have paid into it, so the value of your car, but that's pretty rare. Anyway, so that's just one of the different ways of measuring poverty. So in 2017, for instance, one person would earn $24,600 would put them at the LICO. So anything less than that, they'd be spending too much on survival, I guess, is what that would be the way to think of it. Now, all right, moving on to the next one. We're going to look at the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient. So I know people are like, hey, this seems like math, and you said math was over. Well, I didn't really say math was over. I said the more complex math was over. I said there was still math in this. So what does this measure? This measures income distribution in a country. And so we have two curves here, one representing Norway. This is from earlier on. And one that represents South Africa. And the closer those two lines are, so the smaller that A, so I just drew A on the South Africa one, the smaller that area, the more equal the distribution of wealth is in that population. So the larger B is versus A, the better, right? So at any point that you draw, so this down here is in terms of percentiles, and it goes by, it depends on, sometimes they do it by 20 percentiles, so 5 percentiles. That just, by the way, a percentile, if you don't know what a percentile is, that's a measurement of hundreds, right? So 100%, if you are, say you have, the brain power that's in the 95th percentile, that means that you are there's only 5% of the population that's either has the intelligence you do or higher. That's the idea of percentiles. I am not in the 95th percentile. I wish I was, but I'm not. I don't know if I'd be in the 95th percentile of anything. Humor? No, not humor. I don't know. Anyway. All right. I'll cry later. All right. So basically, this is your percentiles from, not supposed to, 0 to 100. And it's separated, like I said, sometimes I do it in blocks of fifths, where there's a first percentile, which is 1 to 20, second percentile, 21 to 40. You get the idea. And at any point you can measure and see that, say that where you get to, like, say, the 50th percentile, so that's half the population. If it was perfectly distributed, these lines would be exactly the same, and it would be 50th percentile this side and 50th percentile this side, because you'd have the people matching the wage or the income. Of course, we see that's not the case. We have a gap there. The other extreme is if you had looks like this, where, oh my gosh, you get it. Your this curve here, the bottom, the sagging curve, that's the Lorenz curve. It would be straight across the bottom, and the point would be here. That would mean one person controls all the wealth in that population. That's what that looks like. This is a 45 degree line, by the way. Yes, it is. Don't argue. 45 degree, and then the Lorenz curve is the line beneath it. So in terms of numbers, what they do is they take the area of A divided by the area of A plus B, and they come up with a number. So you can see if in the case of it being exactly even with the 45 degree, the A would be 0, therefore you'd get a coefficient of 0, and you'd have perfect distribution. The other one, if it's down here, you'd get no B, so you'd get 1. And so 100, that would mean one person, right, has all the money. So when you look at these ones, so Norway's Gini coefficient is 0.25 or 25%, whereas Brazil is 65% or 0.65, right? So we can see that across all percentiles, Norway is a much more evenly distributed country, much more equal country. I did put, not Brazil, South Africa. I said Brazil because I have a more update number, 2015. For Brazil, 49.7%. Hold on, my phone is suddenly ringing. All right, sorry about that little interruption. That was my wife telling me that she thought I just drove by her, which that's a bizarre thing to call me about. Anyway, whatever, it's fine. What was I saying? Oh, the thing, Lorenz curve. Yeah, that. So if you have the lower 0.25 or 25%, right? The lower the score, the better, than the 0.65 in South Africa, Brazil being about half. So it just gives you an idea of the distribution of income across that line. I'm not going to ask you to draw these or to calculate the Gini coefficient. It's more that if you see it, you know what it's talking about and what the numbers are indicating, right? So again, the smaller the A area, the better, right? The more evenly distributed the income is across all percentiles. And you'll be able to see, right, more of a dip in this area. You can see at this point, there are fewer people that control more of the wealth at the fatter parts of the curve. So that's just, again, just so you know. Now, the next part, these are different ones. I'm hoping some people came across these when they looked at their things. There's tons of different measurement tools you can use. Low income measure, market-based measure, human development index, genuine progress index. These are all ways to measure equality in society, how well economies are doing in various measurements, and they take into account different things. So this, again, the entire point of this video is for you to understand some of these different models and measurements. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put out a couple of videos that you can watch that are not me, thankfully, that have some very interesting stats that go along with it. And what I want you to get out of this, is, what do you think the government could do to improve income distribution? What do you think would help? And we're not going to answer that right away, but I want you to collect the information. Like I said, I'm going to throw out a couple of videos and charts and stuff, and I want you to gather some information together to use later on about the government's ability to redistribute income in society, because we can't have everybody that's not going to make the same amount of money for each job. This is not a communist era where people make the same amount of money not depending on their job, kind of thing. We're not talking about that like an egalitarian thing. We're talking more about people are going to make different amounts of money in a capitalist system, but how do you redistribute through taxes and stuff like that? How do you do that most efficiently to make it as evenly spread out as you can? All right, so gathering information, point form, make sure you keep your sources together. And this is always, if you've come all this way, congratulations. You will know why I've posted those other things, and other people will be sending me questions saying, what am I supposed to do with this chart? And I'll say, watch the video. So there you go.